Number 5. Last night, a friend hurried me out of the house to catch the opening act at a local bar's music event. After a few drinks, I realized my phone wasn't in my pocket. I checked the table at the bar, the bathrooms, and after no luck, I used my friend's phone to call mine. After 2 rings, someone picked up, gave a low, raspy chuckle, and hung up. They didn't answer again. I eventually gave up, thinking it was lost for good, and headed home. When I got back, my phone was sitting on my nightstand exactly where I had left it. Number 4. As a kid, I was always the last to be picked up by the bus driver for school. One day, I was waiting alone, and a bus with no children in it pulled up. The driver smiled and told me to get on. I felt uneasy and asked where the other kids were. He replied, "We'll get them now, just get on." He became more insistent, but didn't do anything extreme. I kept saying no, and a few minutes later, the real bus arrived. I went to school, and my parents were unaware of what had happened. I mentioned it that night, and looking back, they seemed quite concerned. I remember them making a few calls. Number 3. A few years ago, I rented an apartment from a friend. He had just bought it and had it renovated, but couldn't find a buyer, so I agreed to rent it. After moving in, I realized there was something off about the woman next door. She was about 45, but looked much older. She would stay up all night listening to Christian radio and speaking loudly to someone. It got so bad that I couldn't sleep, so I went to her apartment to ask her to keep it down. When she opened the door, I caught a glimpse of the inside. Her walls were covered in crosses in various colors and words like Jesus and angels written everywhere. The windows were painted black, blocking out all light. The carpets were damp and yellow, over 50 years old, and there was dog waste and cockroaches, though no dog. I asked her politely to quiet down, and she just stared at me before shutting the door. Then she cranked the radio up even louder. The next night, my girlfriend stayed over, and I woke up in the middle of the night to see a figure standing next to the bed, staring at us. I thought I was hallucinating, but then the shadow spoke. It was my neighbor, and she was holding something in her hand. She had broken in during the night, and who knows how long she had been standing there. "You should lock your doors at night," she said, before walking out. The next morning, I heard strange noises outside my bedroom window and saw her talking to herself in tongues, holding a plastic bag with her dead dog inside. It was extremely hot outside, and I could smell the decay. At this point, I was terrified. She was clearly unhinged. I went to a neighbor to ask what was going on. He was just as scared and told me that she had broken into his apartment once while he was watching TV with his kids. He had gotten up to get a snack, only to find her behind the couch, staring at him with a power drill in hand. Looking back, I realize now what she had in her hand the night she stood over my bed. I was terrified at this point and called the cops. They were aware of her behavior. She had been diagnosed as a violent schizophrenic who wasn't taking her medication, but they couldn't do anything unless she allowed them to enter her apartment because she owned it. They could only act if she left her place. I stayed up for 2 days, waiting for her to run out of cigarettes. At 2 a.m., I heard her leave to go to a 7-Eleven. I immediately called the cops, who arrived in less than 2 minutes. They restrained her and drove her to a facility. Within a minute, it was like she had never been there. I never saw her again, but I still have nightmares of her watching me while I slept. Number 2. I was about 15 minutes from finishing my night shift when a huge crash came from one of the office windows. I got up to investigate, and someone had thrown a large rock through the window. This was especially strange since I was working in an industrial district at 11:30 p.m. with all the other businesses closed. I called security and went back to my desk, but I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to leave. On my way out, I started to freak myself out more and ended up running to my car. When I got in, I realized I hadn't locked it, and it had been open the entire time. I quickly checked the back seat for anyone lurking, but there was nothing. About 30 minutes later, I called a friend who was out drinking, and I decided to join him. I rode my bike over, enjoying the night, when I heard someone approaching from behind. I stayed to the side, and the person passed me slowly. When they were next to me, they gave me a disturbing smile. I flinched and took a step back, and that's when I noticed they were riding my mom's bike. I immediately sprinted home, and sure enough, her bike was gone, and one of my car's doors was open, the back left one, which I hadn't opened. Number 1, I worked the night shift at a campground from midnight to 8 a.m. each night. It wasn't bad. I would bring my PS2 and play most of the time, only interacting with a few people on busier nights. It was just me in a tiny 8x8 shack surrounded by darkness. My first week on the job, the guy who worked the same shift and was quitting told me about a payphone a few feet from the shack. He said it rang every night at exactly 4:17 a.m., just once. He assumed it was an automated test call and never answered it himself. I worked there for a few months, mostly keeping the windows closed since it was summer. But one night, I started leaving the windows open. And sure enough, at 4:17 a.m., the payphone rang again.